Welcome to the second lecture of the semester 5 lecture series for dairy cattle management uh, and production 2, farm animal production 2. Right, so this is going to be a very short lecture, right? So last week we did this lecture on an overview of the livestock sector. Today it's going to be a much shorter video where we talk about the different agroecological zones, right? So remember, I have already uploaded the questions, pre-test questions, right? Please go through those, right? Because, like I said, it's very important that you go through them before you watch this video, right? So if you haven't gone through those questions yet, please stop this video right away, go to the questions, answer those, take about 2 minutes per question, answer those and come back to the video, right? Okay, so assuming you have already finished the questions, let's start the video, right? So one question was, recall the agroecological zones of Sri Lanka. I hope you were able to say, wet zone, intermediate zone, and dry zone. Right? So you need to have a rough idea about the districts that encompass these different zones, right? So dry zone, wet zone, dry zone, intermediate zone, and wet zone, right? Right. And so wet zone and intermediate zone are again divided into low country, mid country, up country, and dry zone. There is no up country or mid country. It's all low country, right? So ideally, all 7 of these different zones have, to a certain extent, very a unique agriculture and livestock farming system to each of those zones, but we will take an example from the 3 major ones: dry zone, intermediate, and wet zone, right? So one of the major examples in the dairy industry comes from the wet zone up country, right? So wet zone up country, right? So if you see a picture like this, obviously you are not going to say this is dry zone, right? So this is somewhere up close to Norelia, right? So which is up country and wet zone, right? So these so one of the questions was, where will you see grazing animals and where will you see zero grazing, right? So do you think this is grazing or zero grazing? Right, so zero grazing is no grazing, right? But these are animals that actually graze, right? So what's the opposite of this? The opposite of this is zero grazing. 2 other terms you can use to describe that is stall fed, right? So meaning they are fed in a stall, right? Now these animals are not fed in a stall, right? They are fed in the field outside, right? So the opposite of this is, stall fed, where they are fed inside a stall or cattle barn, also known as cut and fed, right? So here there is no cutting and feeding. The animals graze themselves. But cut and feeding means the farmer will cut the grass and take it to the stall where the cows are, right? So this is grazing. The other system is, you can call it zero grazing, cut and fed, or stall fed, right? So however, the question was, in which management system will you see grazing the highest, right? So now, although you see grazing animals here, right, in these farms, animals not now there are different stages of dairy animals, right? We haven't gone there yet. Lactating animals, dry animals, so on, right? So although certain stages of animals are sent out grazing, the most productive stages where animals are producing a lot of milk, high lactation, those animals are typically cut and fed, right? But if you look at the dry zone, that's where you have a lot of grazing. Animals almost exclusively, regardless of the stage of lactation, they are grazing all the pasture lands, or just not even cultivated pasture. Now here you will see this is cultivated pasture. You see just one type of a pasture here, right? There are no weeds and so on, right? But the animals that the grazing, so-called grazing land you find in the dry zone and intermediate zone, they are not cultivated pasture. They are just, Kaleta land, right? And there happens to be pasture which the animals will go and graze, but typically a lot more poor quality compared to this, but these animals are grazing, right? Okay, so so the animals will be grazing in the upcountry wet zone system. However, it's not the main source, unlike in the dry zone, right? So this is an example for cut and fed. See, the grass has been cut and brought inside the barn, right? So they are being fed inside the stall, right? So stall fed, you can call this, right? So stall is not this, stall is an individual cubicle, right? So somehow, anyway, this is a cut and fed system, but this is not grazing. Okay, right? So this is also a feature. So what other features of this photograph tell you that this is from the upcountry? And you see, there are no the walls are really high here, right? But if you look at a dry zone, so imagine having, so this roof is also relatively short, right? So what do you think will happen in the dry zone if you have a short roof and high walls? Do you think animals will find it comfortable? No, it will be baking hot inside that, right? So if I give you this or similar photograph and ask you which agroecological zone do you think this belongs to, you should be able to say this is upcountry based on the relatively short roof and side walls have been covered, right? So because otherwise the cold wind draft will be too cold for the animal. Okay, and so this is another example of the upcountry system. That is actually New Zealand farm, right? So these are a specific group of animals. Actually, they are close to parturition or calving, right? If I remember right, these are close-up dry period, animals of the close-up dry period. We'll talk about that as we go along, right? And this is also New Zealand farm, I believe. These are calf shed. You see, these are all for calves, right? Young calves are raised inside small pens like this. So we call these individual ones calf pens, but this whole building that has all these different calf pens, we call it you can call it the calf unit, you can call it the nursery barn, right? Calf shed, so on. So this is a different farm. This is actually a farm, the photographs have been taken while the farm was still being half built, right? So this is called the Wattawala farm, right? You probably recall that Wattawala has the highest rainfall in Sri Lanka. You would have learned for Samaj Adhyayana or whatever, social studies in school, right? So this is also from the upcountry wet zone, right? Right. So the main characteristics, right? So I also asked you about different breeds, right? So I hope you were able to come up breeds like Holstein Friesian, Ayrshire, Jersey, so on. And so the main breeds you see in the upcountry are temperate breeds. Usually Holstein Friesian. Just one farm, namely the Ambewala farm, has Ayrshire. Right? Other than that, all other farms have mostly Holstein Friesian or Friesian crosses, right? You can have large herd sizes, right, up to 500. But actually, New Zealand Ambewala farm, they are in the process of upgrading their farm sizes. So they might upgrade up to about 2,000-3,000 animals. Right? So Wattavala farm also had about 400 animals when they started. Recently they got a second batch of animals, so they have more animals than that now. So there are several farms in the upcountry region where you have more than 100 animals, right? But typically in Sri Lanka, it's like 1 or 2 animals per farm, right? Maybe 20 maximum for a medium scale farm. But a characteristic of upcountry wet zone is that you can have large sizes of farms, right? So there are at least half a dozen farms with more than 100 animals, right? So like I said, these characterized by cut and fed, right? Feeding system. Climate is very conducive to grazing also, but you see, I said grazing is most common in the dry zone, right? So although people send animals grazing in the dry zone, the weather is not conducive, it's not friendly for grazing, because when you send animals grazing, right, so they are in the hot sun, right, so heat stress, and animal has to spend energy on thermoregulation, control the body heat. And when animal does that, the energy that it could have used for milk production is lost, right? So instead of producing energy, producing milk, using energy for producing milk, now the animal has to use that energy for thermoregulation, right? So therefore, we don't recommend sending animals grazing in warm climates, but of course, those people, they have no choice but to send them grazing, right? So that's why you'll see, if you go during daytime, animals will gather under shady areas where possible, right, under large trees and so on. So that I also asked you about to recall the semi-intensive, intensive and extensive management systems, right? So intensive management system is highly labor intensive. Animals are housed inside houses like this, barns, we call them cow barns, right? They don't live at all, right? Completely cut and fed. But in the case of semi-intensive farming system, animals at certain stages they will be cut and fed, and certain stages they will be sent grazing, right? So especially growing animals, heifers, and dry animals after lactation. So between 2 lactation periods, there is 2-month dry period. So during that dry period, because animals are not using a lot of energy, you can send them grazing. Now, can you guess a place where you can't send animals grazing at all? Right? So there are certain parts of the world, there are very, very large dairy farms, right? But these animals are not sent grazing. They are purely on cut and fed system, right? Even inside the barns, right? Even for dry animals, all that. Can you guess where? I think it's Europe, Australia, America, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, China. Well, the answer is the Middle East. Middle East has some of the largest dairy farms in the world. Of course, they can't grow any pasture, right? So they have to rely on imported feed, that will be taken inside the barn and fed inside the barn. However, in Sri Lanka, you can send animals grazing, right? So it would be expensive. It's always expensive to stall feed because you have to go and harvest the pasture, transport it, so on and so forth. But it's cheaper to send animals grazing, right? However, if animals are, high producing animals, you want to conserve energy because if you send them grazing, even in cold weather, right, you still have to, the animals have to walk, right? So walking also burns energy, right? So that's why you keep them in the same place without sending them out on grazing so that they can, just eat and convert that energy into milk rather than wasting it in the sun, out in the sun or by walking, right? So anyway, but in Sri Lanka, almost all farms, they would send animals grazing at some stage, dry period or heifer period, right? So we don't have purely intensive farms, right? There might be a very few, but large farms generally they send. But I suppose the Ridiyagama farm in Ridiyagama dry zone, they may not send animals grazing because of the hot weather, but I don't know that for sure, right? I don't know that for sure, but I presume they will not send any group of animals grazing in the sun because it's very hot climate there, right? So because of the conducive climate, right, we have the best producing animals, right? So when you say highest producing animals, we might be talking about animals averaging about 20 liters per day per cow, right? Which means during peak lactation, they may produce even up to 50 liters during peak lactation per day, right? So animals after calving, they don't give the same amount, they do not give the same amount of milk every day, right? It, like everything else in the world, it follows a curve. Soon after it calves, milk production is relatively less. Then very soon it goes high, very high, right? And then after about 2 months, it starts to drop. So typically, peak production happens somewhere between, 4 to 10 weeks after parturition, right? Now, from my experience in other countries, in developed countries, peak lactation takes place after about 8 to 10 weeks. But in Sri Lanka, peak lactation happens much earlier than that, maybe as early as 4 weeks, right? So we are too premature to discuss those details here. When it comes to lactating cow management, I will talk about those, right? So at this point, what you need to understand is that in general, the highest producing cows of Sri Lanka are in the wet zone upcountry, right? And Nuwara also happens to be the highest producing district, right? Central province happens to be the highest producing province, right? And Nuwara highest producing district. Right? So all in the wet zone upcountry, like I said, because the climate, feed, all that is very friendly for dairy industry. Right, so now we look at the characteristics of the dairy industry in the intermediate zone, which is this, right? Kurunegala, Badulla, Uva, Sabaragamu, part of Sabaragamu. Right. So remember all the large scale farms we saw there, Ambewala farm, New Zealand farm, Wattawala farm. But look at the contrast. Remember the high walls that I showed you? they were almost very dark inside, right? Because there was a low roof and very tall side walls, right? But look at this. This is 100% open almost, right? And that large structure is not there. Again, you see, there is a cut and fed system. But look at the difference of the animals. What type of animals did we see there? Mainly in the wet zone upcountry, we saw Holstein Friesian. Then I said, just one particular farm has ISIS, right? But look at these animals. Are they Friesian? No, right? So these are Jersey crossers, probably, right? Most likely. Facial features and the color. Look at the size of them. Yeah, they're relatively short compared to these man, right? So another example. See, look at the structure. So these are small to medium scale farmers, right? So earlier I told you about farms with as many as 500 animals. At least half a dozen farms with more than 100 animals in the wet zone upcountry. But intermediate zone, there might be a few farms between 50 and 100 animals, right? But nowhere as near as the scale in the upcountry, right? So most of them are small scale farmers like this. Let's see. And look at this one. So like I said earlier, no walls here. Remember the contrast with the upcountry. No side walls. Roof right? So allowing enough ventilation, right? Inside. Here, it's almost a makeshift temporary hut, right? But somehow, this is the type of cattle housing you see in the intermediate zone and dry zone, right? So the breeds are different. You have Jerseys and Friesian cross Jerseys, small to intermediate sizes, up to 50. There might be a few, farms that are above 50 animals, but mostly small scale farmers, 5, 10 animals, right? 20, 30 sometimes. And cut and fed usually. Sometimes they are sent grazing also. But like I said, the environment, the weather is not friendly, not conducive to send animals grazing. Right, so again, semi-intensive to intensive management system. So these are not high producing cows like the ones you saw in the upcountry, right? So if the upcountry animals, peaked at 40 liters and average 20, these guys will probably give Jersey animals even in their peak, they may not produce more than 20-25 liters, right? And then the dry zone, right, which is the majority of the country. And suddenly, here you are seeing this is an extensively managed system. See, animals are grazing, right? So you might see them in the middle of the road also like this. So herds of animals grazing. Right? So the owner might be somewhere in the vicinity. And so remember I said in the upcountry, if you see animals grazing, they are most likely, cultivated pasture land. And here you see, these are not cultivated pasture land. Look at the stark contrast of the animals. See, bony prominences, not well fed, atakatu padila, right? Very emaciated kind of animals, right? Compared to those in the upcountry, right? Sometimes, no, not even grazing pasture. This is what they eat, right? So you will learn when you come to 4th year, this eating trash or garbage leads to a lot of complications when they eat polythene, right? Because the natural system is not made to eat polythene in nature. But when they eat polythene, they can get stuck in the rumen, leading to complications called, rumen impaction and so forth, which you will learn when you come to do surgery and medicine, right? So here's a typical structure. So I gave a question. I asked you, what is night paddocking, right? So there is a feature in the dry zone where during daytime they send the animals grazing, not usually on the road, middle of the road like this, but they send animals to these wooded areas, right? And at the night, they bring them back to a land where they are temporarily housed. See, night paddocking, only at night, right? Night paddocking. Okay. So sometimes they would do night paddocking. What's that? That's a calf. So why is the calf tied outside? To prevent consuming milk from the mother, right? So now sometimes these herds, they don't milk the animals at all. They don't milk at all, no milking at all, right? Because one, these animals are aggressive, and there are no facilities to restrain them, right? And so on, right? And they just can't bother because they give such a small amount of milk and the calves have already drunk it, right? So that's why they do this, night paddocking. Sometimes they would, tie the calves outside during night time. So during night time, the milk accumulates. And in the morning, before they release the animals for grazing, they would milk the lactating animal. Sometimes might be as little as half a bottle, 1 bottle, 2 bottles in a good animal, something like that. Which is 1 liter, 1.5 liter. So small amounts of milk, but that is also something better than nothing. Right? But during daytime, the calves will be there together with the parents. See, calves will be there with the mother, and they will suckle the mother during daytime, right? But at night, they will be tied outside, and in the morning before the animals are released for grazing, they will quickly milk them out, right? So until recently, only this type of dairy farming existed in the dry zone, but several years ago, few years ago, maybe forgot exactly, maybe 2012, 13, 14, somewhere around those years, the Ridiyagama farm was established in Ambilipiti area, right? And so massive farm. They hold about 3,000 animals, if I remember right. Mainly Jersey Friesian process. So now we have an intensively managed commercial scale farm in the dry zone, but before that it was all extensive management system, right? That's the point I wanted to make. So these are the major characteristics of the dry zone dairy industry. You get Bos indicus crosses right now in the intermediate and upcountry. That was rare, right? But in the dry zone, you have, in the intermediate zone also, you may have a few Sahiwal crosses, right? But not in the upcountry, wet zone. But in the dry zone, you have a lot of those, and then you have some of these also, right? So all these what we see here, they are not jerseys, just because they are brown. They are all, so this is the white cattle, which is indigenous to Sri Lanka, right? So it's a white cattle, and all these are, indigenous cattle. Some of them are indigenous cattle, others are crossers, Sahiwal crossers, Bos indicus crossers, right? And then there are some new farms with Jersey Holstein Friesian crossers also, right? Small to intermediate, large nomadic herds. Nomadic is like being nomads, moving from place to place, herds, right? So mostly grazing, cut and fed is very limited. Ridiyagam, of course, they practice that, but cut and fed very limited. Usually grazing in large herds, right? So that is the characteristic feature of the dry zone dairy industry. And of course, there is night paddocking in some places, right? So semi-intensive to extensive. Intensive only seen in, right? So if you recall the previous two systems, you had an intensive to semi-intensive dairy management system, where here it's semi-intensive to extensive except at Ridiagama, right? Remember we said for upcountry, wet zone, highest producing cows in Sri Lanka, right? But in the dry zone, probably the lowest producing cows will be found in the dry zone. Those white cattle that I showed you, they give maybe 1 or 2 bottles of milk maximum, or they are not milked at all, right? So some of them are used purely for beef, right? Masata patamanaka tamai the only goal of the owner, right? So owner has no intention of milking animals, right? So he rears these animals in large herds, up to hundreds of animals, and then he sells the animals to the slaughterhouse, right? Some mudalali will buy and bring it to the slaughterhouse. So those are the main characteristics of the different dairy management systems in the 3 main agroecological zones, right? So you need to know the principles of those, right? Not minor details, but you need to know the major characteristic differences between the 3 systems, 3 agroecological zones, right? And then Sri Lanka also has about 500,000 buffalo, right? 400,000 something, right? So and we have quite a few, intensive type of buffalo management also, where buffalo will be milked using milking machines, right? Obviously, it's a draft animal, right? And buffalo slaughter is prohibited in Sri Lanka, and people don't eat buffalo meat. However, sometimes in the meat market, buffalo meat is being sold as beef, right? So you need to know the common breeds of buffalo in Sri Lanka, how to identify each of the breeds, right? So it's not as easy as differentiating Jersey versus Frisian versus Sahiwal, right? Because all buffalo look the same, right? But there are certain characteristic features that are, unique to each of these breeds. And of course, you have indigenous breed, local breed also. So you need to know where the highest buffalo populations are. Is it in the north, south, or is it in Nurelia, right? You need to know those. The different uses, like I said, used for draft purposes, and then for milk and milk byproducts, value-added products, so on. So you think large herds are not common, but they are not uncommon, Certain parts of the country, you do see herds, as big as a couple of hundred sometimes for buffalo, right? So something you need to know for both cattle and buffalo is you have to be really careful with these animals. They are wild animals. They have an enormous amount of strength, right? So if you don't handle them properly, you can even die, right? Buffaloes are very rough animals compared to cattle, right? So don't get close to a buffalo or even cattle, dairy cattle, without the owner being there, right? Or unless you're really confident, you have been in the industry for a long time, and මයිලක් බැලුවක් කියන්න පුළුවන් ගානට ආවම කොයි වගේ සතෙක්ද කියලා it doesn't matter, but otherwise always keep your distance, right? So you can find most of these details on the livestock statistical bulletin and the DAPH annual report. I have uploaded onto the reference section. Goat, Dr. Fauci has already started lectures, right? So there are dairy breeds, dual purpose breeds, meat breeds, so on, right? But what breed do you think this is? This is actually not goat, this is sheep. So this sheep, this is called, this is a breed called Jaffna local sheep, which is exclusively found in the Jaffna Peninsula. Right, so you need to know about these breeds, their purposes, distribution in Sri Lanka, different uses, right, so on. I have attached a goat statistical bulletin also. Right, and then you need to know, of course, you'll go into great detail on poultry, right, but I'm giving you just a very short introduction. The poultry is found mainly in Kurunegala, Gampa and Puttlam. Right, so these are the main commonest districts, right? You can have, just like you had small scale, medium scale, large scale, semi-intensive, intensive, extensive farming. Poultry also is like that. So these are relatively large scale, very large scale farms, right? Do you think these birds are relatively young or old? They look pretty young to me, right? This is a large scale, highly mechanized, closed house system, right? You see very high stocking density, yeah? So animal welfare perspective, but just how it is, everywhere it's like that. So compared to these, can you see that these are well grown animals? Right, so they are well grown animals, right? So you see some structures on that side. What do you think those might be? Right, so these are feeders and waterers, right? These are completely different type of system. What these are called battery cages. So although stocking density is very high here also, battery cages are extremely, considered inhumane, because see, even though there is stocking density is high, animals can still walk. එකෙක්ගේ ඇඟුරු නැගලා හරි එහා පැත්තට යන්න පුළුවන්. But උඩින් හරි ඉඳ තියෙනවා, there's room above the head. Here in the battery cages, they can't move at all, right? They are just very inhumane. All life they are like here, මේ කනවා excreta බිත්තර දානවා. හරි බිත්තරේ රෝල්ලා ඉස්සරහට එනවා, right? So these are discouraged now, going away from the poultry industry, right? So these are relatively small scale poultry farm. Same principles, waterers, feeders, small gate to go inside. They can lower these during sun, when the sun is strong, so that the indoors keep cool. Right, so that was a question, I asked a question. So we said poultry population in Sri Lanka is about 40 million, and then if it's 40 million, that comes to about 3 million births per month, right? So you would recall from your, first year knowledge or your A-level knowledge that eggs need to be incubated by chicken, right? Rakinane, bitter rakinane. If you have 3 million eggs, first of all, 3 million eggs are 3 million mothers line, right? And then secondly, 3 million eggs are incubate karane, right? So 3 million eggs can't have 3 million mothers, because birds, chickens, lay eggs continuously, right? In sometimes whole month they keep laying, right? And so 3 million eggs won't have 3 million mothers, right? And then incubation, it's done very in a highly sophisticated mechanized manner, right? So you have incubators, right, which rotate and which maintain a particular temperature and all that, And then you also have hatcheries, where these eggs hatch in very large scale. See, hatchery. So in summary, you need to know the major dairy, goat, sheep, buffalo, swine, breeds, their characteristics. I didn't actually touch on swine today, but you need to know all those, right? Their uses, their production capacities, right? Distribution within different agricultural zones of Sri Lanka, etc. You need to go into a lot of details, right? However, at least for dairy and buffalo breeds, you need to know how much they produce. So that's what I mean by production capacity. How much milk do they produce per lactation? What would they produce during peak? What is the typical daily production? Right, breed characteristics. Right, so some of the buffalo breeds have white patches on the forehead, on the feet, on the tail, certain characteristics inside the eyes, right? So these are the characteristics that you need to know about. Okay, so that concludes lecture 2. On the next lecture, lecture 3, we will talk about the global situation of the dairy industry, and afterwards we will start, dairy cattle management, calf management, heifer management, lactating cow management, housing management, pregnancy, parturition, all those. Huh? Okay, good luck. I hope you have answered the questions before beginning listening to this, and now you can go back and correct your answers. Right? Okay, thank you. See you next week.